Hello, how's it going? Today I was at the Porirua Library and they were getting rid of some books and I ended up getting this book. There's several reasons why. I haven't actually read the book much yet at all, if I just haven't actually read it. The epic rivalry that destroyed an empire and forged our age. This is the actual title of the book. Ghandi and Churchill, Arthur Herman. Arthur, Arthur, Herman, Herman. I might just read the back of the book. And I think I might need some decent light and Mohandas Ghandi and Winston Churchill, India's moral leader and Great Britain's greatest Prime Minister, born 5 years and 7,000 miles apart, they became embodiments of the nations they led. Both became living icons, idealised and admired around the world. Today they remain enduring models of leadership in democratic society. Yet the truth was Churchill and Ghandi were bitter enemies throughout their lives. This book reveals for the first time how that rivalry shaped the 20th century and beyond. For more than 40 years, from 1906 to 1948, Ghandi and Churchill were locked in a tense struggle for the hearts and minds of the British public and for world opinion. Although they met only once, their titanic contest of wills would decide the fate of nations, continents, peoples, and ultimately an empire. Here is a sweeping epic with a fascinating supporting cast and a brilliant narrative parable of two men whose great successes were always haunted by personal failure and whose final moments of triumph were overshadowed by the loss of what they held most dear. And God, how bloody boring everything. Stay awake. Try and stay awake. I plead with you. Oh God. Fuck. Mohandas Ghandi and Winston Churchill, India's moral leader and Great Britain's greatest Prime Minister, born 5 years and 7,000 miles apart, they became embodiments of the nations they led. Both became living icons, idealised and admired around the world. Today they remain enduring models of leadership in democratic society. Yet the truth was Churchill and Ghandi were bitter enemies throughout their lives. This book reveals for the first time how that rivalry shaped the 20th century and beyond. For more than 40 years, from 1906 to 1948, Ghandi and Churchill were locked in a tense struggle for the hearts and minds of the British public and for world opinion. Although they met only once, their titanic contest of wills would decide the fate of nations, continents, peoples, and ultimately an empire. Here is a sweeping epic with a fascinating supporting cast and a brilliant narrative parable of two men whose greatest successes were always haunted by personal failure and whose final moments of triumph were overshadowed by the loss of what they held most dear. Now, I've been fascinated by both of these characters in recent times on internet, on YouTube, because I'm an avid follower of YouTube. I came across people saying that Winston Churchill was a dreadful racist, and from what videos I've seen about the people saying that Winston Churchill was a horrendous racist. They seem to give good evidence, and their arguments are logical, cohesive. I've done for years and years. I've done studies on the British Empire, and obviously Winston Churchill. He was a politician. He was in the war. He was high class, and he, God knows what I'm trying to say. Fuck. 4 a.m. in the morning of the 1st of shitty January. 2023. So, Winston Churchill racism. Winston Churchill racism.
On the sunny northern edge of Hawara, a new type of neighbourhood.
Back in news, so is the mention of Winston Churchill. Was he really a racist? Yes, he was. His racism is well documented, and now we bring you some pages from history. Let's have a look at our next report.
A wartime Prime Minister, celebrated statesman, touted a hero of the free world. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill is remembered in Britain as one of the land's finest. After all, he saved the country from a Nazi invasion. But to the world outside Britain, Churchill was hardly better than Hitler. To the West, he was a fierce imperialist. Imperialism being a validation for Churchill's racist mindset. The racism is well documented. I hate Indians, Churchill once wrote. They are a beastly people with a
Okay, we don't need to go any further than that, do we? I hate Indians. I remember reading years ago, I think it might have been part of, I remember doing studies on the Victorian era. I'm not sure whether Winston Churchill was actually part of the Victorian era. But yeah, it came up, and this was part of the criticism I remember in recent times levelled against Winston Churchill and his supposedly deplorable racism. But it's more than racism if you understand what was going on. I remember watching, it was Piers Morgan, and there was a black woman. I don't know if she had any Kenyan heritage, but it seems to be what the white people generally did. Well, there's a lot of horrible evidence that white people in general, over large periods of modern history and even recent history, treated black people deplorably. And there was a case that in some shape or form, I'm not an expert on this, as I say, this is research and I'm educating myself to go into it. Oh, it is offensive to quote Churchill, Good Morning Britain. I don't think it was that particular one. There was another one. Should we be ashamed of Winston Churchill? Oh, glory be.
Only a few people with the highest IQ can solve this on the first try. You just have to link the same.
I think most people think of him as a hero. Why isn't he?
I know why most people think of him as a hero, because they know absolutely nothing about huge aspects of his legacy. So Churchill was obsessed with his hatred for Indians, so much so...
Of Indians?
Of Indians, so much so that his right-wing conservative colleagues in cabinet were worried about the level of his racism and how out of touch it was with the time. So the idea that he was kind of part of this moment in history where everyone in Britain was racist and it's not fair to impose modern standards on him is simply not true. Cabinet colleagues urged him to take action to prevent deaths in India, and he refused. And when he was charged with leading to these famine deaths, he said that they were breeding like rabbits.
So you would take down his statue, would you?
I didn't say I would take down his statue. I would like people to know...
Why would you want a statue to such an...
I would like people to know this side of his history so they can make up their own minds. The reality is, we continue to produce films which are more like propaganda than history. The idea of Churchill standing alone as he's depicted in The Darkest Hour, you know, Britain alone at this moment of war. Britain had an empire.
Winston Churchill was the man that saved the world from Adolf Hitler, from Nazism, from a man that wanted to exterminate every Jew in the world, right, including your grandfather. If it hadn't been for Winston Churchill rallying this country in the way that he did, then things could have turned out very, very differently, not least for your family. Why are you not prepared to look to the bigger picture of someone like Winston Churchill, who, frankly, I genuinely believe if it wasn't for him, we would have lost that war.
So this is the bigger picture, Piers. You know, my grandfather's not alive anymore, but his younger brother is. He might be watching, actually. He was kinder transport. He would say that Churchill, were it not for Churchill, he may not be alive, and that Churchill saved the world from Nazi fascism, which is true. I'm not trying to deny that or
So
downplay
why
that
come on
history.
a programme like this and just call
Because
him a nasty racist? We should not be
this is the
saluting as a hero.
What you're saying is
That is
exactly
the
the problem.
problem for
No,
me, yeah.
why can't we accommodate a reality where somebody, on the one hand, won the war and beat fascism, but on the other hand, had racist, white supremacist views that also led to the deaths of millions of people? Why can't we accept that both things are true?
OK, Gisela, Winston Churchill's an awful bloke, and we shouldn't be thinking anything else about him.
And if he hadn't been the Prime Minister from 1940 to 45, we would have a different view of the man. My predecessor in Birmingham was actually a guy called Neville Chamberlain. So I kind of saw the figures who, you probably in terms of his life, you probably never would have accused him of having any wrong views.
No offence, but
however,
you have to Neville Chamberlain, we'd always speak in German like you, Gisela.
Indeed, which shows me that in politics and in life, the cometh the hour, cometh the man. And you had someone who had faults. I think his views on India is probably the one thing everybody would agree he got it wrong. However, he was the one who managed to bring the Americans into the war. His stubbornness, his relentless refusal to accept that we weren't defeated. That's what makes him a great life, and that's why you have to look at it in the whole. The real problem we've got these days is that we focus on the things which people have got wrong, and therefore we really are undermining the occasions when you need leaders.
So Winston Churchill's case, we focus on everything that he got right.
And if like me, you're somebody who...
Do we notice that the comments are turned off? And I want comments are turned off. Learn more. Dare I suggest that there would be horrendous arguments over this? London man disrupts Black Lives Matter demo, kicks away protest signs at Churchill. I didn't realise. I think I'd seen this before, but I didn't realise it was I think woke attacks on Winston Churchill are libel and lies. Really? Woke attacks, eh? Woke attacks on Churchill.
as the greatest Briton to have ever lived, is currently guarded by a fence. Why is that? Last year, this statue was vandalised with the words "was a racist" during the BLM protests. In these culture wars, statues like this have become the epicentre of debates around our history. But what is the truth behind Winston Churchill? Was he the man who liberated Europe and the world from the tyranny of the Nazis? Or was he a coloniser, a racist and an imperialist?
Today is Victory in Europe Day. God save the King.
In this series, I'm going to be exploring 4 controversial figures from our past, all of whom have statues which are under pressure to be taken down. Are these men truly good or evil? Can we judge them by the standards of today? And should we be attempting to rewrite our history at all? To answer these questions, I'm going to be joined by an historian each week, where I will be putting the case against each figure from history. I will present all of their supposed faults, mistakes and tragedies, whilst the historian will give an alternative view. Who better to start with than Winston Churchill, a man whose life has been obsessed over by millions around the globe. Churchill biographer Andrew Roberts joins me to discuss the wartime Prime Minister in History Defended. So I'm going to be presenting the case of the prosecution against Winston Churchill. I'm going to go through several character flaws and other traits that he may have that were negative or criticised today. So let's start with the core accusation against Churchill that was written on his statue, that he was a racist. So I've got some quotes here I'm going to read out that obviously people quote all the time to say, look, Churchill had these awful views on race. So in 1937, he said, "I do not admit, for instance, that the great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wide race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." He also talked about, "I hate Indians, they are beastly people with a beastly religion." He referred to Palestinians as barbaric hordes who ate little but camel dung. And finally, he said, "I think we shall have to take the Chinese in hand and regulate them. The Aryan stock is bound to triumph." Was Churchill a racist?
No, he wasn't. Some of the quotes that you've given are completely invented, such as the one about eating camel dung. Others are, you fail to put in any kind of context whatsoever. Others are just made up by his enemies. Almost all of the ones to do with India come from one person, a political enemy of his, Leo Amery. I'm not saying he didn't say them. He might well have said something like them. But the fact that he said things that were derogatory to people of other races does not make him somebody who wants bad things to happen to people of other races, which I think is what a racist is. Just to say that he thinks that white people were superior to non-whites is obvious, owing to the fact that he was born in 1874 whilst Charles Darwin was still alive. And it was the scientific belief that there were a hierarchy of the races. Now, we today know that that's obscene and absurd, but in those days it was what was considered scientifically accurate. Some of your other quotations, the one, for example, about the Native Americans, and that really is exactly what people thought about historical development, that the more advanced, the more weaponized group was going to win wars. By the way, I don't think that there are very many military historians today who think anything else. So no, if you treat Churchill as a man of his time and also appreciate the things that he did for non-white people throughout his life and his belief in the British Empire, the fact that he put his life on the line endlessly to defend non-white people on the northwest frontier, for example, and in the Sudanese campaign where he took part in the abolition of slavery, for example. Actually, overall, and down in South Africa, of course, where he opposed the Boers, overall, he was a tremendously good thing for non-whites, and he wouldn't have been if he was a racist.
If we take the word racist and look at the definition, I mean, there's so many definitions of it, but the sort of literal definition of believing that one race is superior to another, did he believe that, or would you not even concede that?
Well, of course, I've just said. Of course he did. That's what...
Well, that little video, it was a very interesting video. From me listening to what they were saying, the historian there was pointing out the fact that a lot of the very negative, seemingly racist quotations supposedly coming from Winston Churchill were from one of his opponents, his enemies. So obviously they would have been biased, and that there's a good argument that either they don't really exist or that they've been over exaggerated. I think he said something to the effect that it's plausible that he might have said those things, which is a very interesting thing. I didn't realise about that. And he brings up the thing about him fighting against slavery, and that he actually seems to have done some things that were beneficial for non-white people. Yeah, I wonder what these black activists would have to say about slavery, and they don't seem to ever. I remember in the thing about slavery and white people and their responsibility, they go, oh yes, well white people started slavery, but they also ended it. And I think, as far as I understand, most cultures in the world have had slavery. None of them except the British, the Anglo-Saxon society, with its centre in Britain, at the Atlantic, Northern Atlantic, that have said that slavery is inherently wrong, morally inherently wrong, and actually put their lives on the line and gone out there and made it institutionally illegal, and gone and fought to overturn slavery. That's what I've been led to believe. One thing about Winston I was reading that I was very impressed. I realised, obviously, that he was a politician, and he seemed to have done a pretty good job. I realised he fought in the Boer War. But he seems to have been very talented on many fields. I immediately in my mind, I wonder if anyone's ever really compared. Well, we were watching that video just before, and somebody was comparing him. I think it was that one there, that they were comparing Churchill to Hitler. I think the comment went something to the effect, oh, and what he's saying here and his actions here, that's the type of thing Hitler would have done and said. I must say that at least when he was old, he certainly wasn't very attractive. Goodness knows what he must have looked like when he was a lot younger. Which reminds me of George W. Bush Jr. I think that's right, George W. Bush Jr. I think he is a junior. Oh, they refer to him as junior because his father was president as well. Wasn't it George Bush Sr., then Clinton, and then George Bush Jr. as president? oh my God, if you think about it, I lived through those years, and they were very eventful years and not so long ago. But let's try and stay on track. I've forgotten now what I was going to say. In this book, Ghandi and Churchill by Arthur Herman, I went straight to the back and I just looked for the word racism. There isn't anything there. And then I looked for famine, because one of the major things about the detractors saying that Winston Churchill is a racist is the fact that he seems to have deliberately allowed a famine to happen. And I think that was 1943. But, yeah, anyway, I have got this book and I might read a little bit. It's about two very fascinating famous characters in history, Ghandi and Churchill. And, yeah, will be very entertaining, enlightening, a good educational round, I feel. And this video has to come to an end because it can't go on forever, and it's already 26 minutes.